Before we dive into this story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the journey ahead. My name is Harold Whitmore, and at 80 years old, I thought I'd heard every cruel word this world had to offer. I was wrong. It was a Tuesday evening in September when my life changed forever. The community center on Maple Street, the same building where I'd taught my grandson to tie his shoes, where Eleanor and I had our first dance as newlyweds 55 years ago, was scheduled for demolition. They wanted to tear it down for another shopping plaza. I shuffled into that packed meeting room with my worn leather folder containing old blueprints and photographs. My hands weren't as steady as they used to be, but my resolve was iron. This wasn't just about a building. It was about preserving the heart of our neighborhood. The room buzzed with conversations as I found a seat in the back. Young professionals in expensive suits dominated the front rows, their laptops glowing like tiny beacons of progress. I recognized some faces, children I'd watched grow up, now dressed in corporate armor. When they called for public comments, I slowly made my way to the microphone. My cane tapped rhythmically against the linoleum floor, each step echoing in the suddenly quiet room. I cleared my throat and began to speak about the center's history, about the families it had served, about the community it had built. That's when she stood up. Madison Cross was her name, though I didn't know it then. Tall, sharp-dressed, with eyes that could cut glass and a voice that could freeze blood. She wore confidence like expensive perfume, overwhelming and impossible to ignore. "Excuse me," she interrupted, her words slicing through my sentence like a blade, "but we're here to discuss progress, not nostalgia." The room fell silent. I felt every pair of eyes turn toward us, this unlikely duel between generations. "Young lady," I began gently, "this building has served our community for—" "We don't want you here, you fossil." The words hit me like a physical blow. In all my years, through war, loss, and heartbreak, no one had ever dismissed my very existence with such casual cruelty. The room gasped collectively, but she continued, relentless. "Your generation had your time. Now it's ours. This neighborhood needs investment, not some crumbling monument to the past that you can't let go of." I stood there, gripping my cane tighter than I should have, feeling my heart hammer against my ribs. Around me, faces I'd known for decades looked away in embarrassment, some for her, some for me. I could have fought back. God knows I had the words, the experience, the righteous anger. But instead, I simply closed my folder, nodded once, and walked toward the exit. As I reached the door, I heard her voice again, softer now but still carrying, "Some people just don't know when their story is over." I paused at the threshold, my hand on the cool metal handle. For just a moment, I turned back and looked at her, really looked at her. There was something familiar about those eyes, something that stirred a memory I couldn't quite place. But I said nothing. Sometimes the most powerful response is silence. As I stepped into the cool evening air, breathing deeply to calm my racing heart, I made myself a promise. This story, my story, was far from over. And that young woman had just written herself into the most important chapter of both our lives. She thought she knew who Harold Whitmore was. She was about to discover she didn't know anything at all. I drove home that night with my hands shaking on the steering wheel, not from age, but from something I hadn't felt in decades, the sting of being made invisible. But as I sat in my empty house, surrounded by 55 years of memories with Eleanor, the hurt began to transform into something else entirely. Let me tell you who Harold Whitmore really is, because that young woman clearly had no idea. I was 19 when I shipped out to Korea in 1952. While other boys my age were chasing girls and worrying about college, I was learning how to build bridges under enemy fire and how to hold a dying friend's hand in a frozen foxhole. I came home with a Purple Heart, 2 bronze stars, and skills in engineering that would shape the next 6 decades of my life. Eleanor was waiting for me when I returned. Sweet Eleanor Martinez, with her infectious laugh and eyes that could see straight through to a man's soul. We married in 1955, right here in that same community center that Madison Cross wants to demolish. I built our first house with my own hands, every nail driven with love and hope for our future. The 1960s brought opportunity. I started Cross and Whitmore Construction with my business partner, Robert Cross. Yes, that's right, Cross. The same last name that would echo through that meeting room decades later. Robert was ambitious, charming, and had connections I could never dream of. I was the one with the engineering expertise and the work ethic that could move mountains. Together, we built half this town. The elementary school where 3 generations of children learned to read, that was my design. The bridge over Miller's Creek that connects the east and west sides of our community. I calculated every stress point and supervised every pour of concrete. The Veterans Housing Complex that gave homes to 47 families. I worked 18-hour days for 2 years to make that dream a reality. But success came with choices, and those choices revealed who we really were. In 1978, we landed the biggest contract of our careers, a shopping complex that would make us both millionaires. The only problem was the location. The city wanted to build it where the old Veterans Hospital stood, the same place where dozens of my war buddies received the care that kept them alive. Robert saw dollar signs. I saw betrayal. "Harold," he said in that smooth voice of his, "sentiment doesn't pay the bills. These old soldiers will find care somewhere else." But I knew better. I'd visited those halls every week for 20 years. These weren't just old soldiers. They were men who'd given everything for this country and deserved better than being displaced for profit. I made a choice that night that cost me a fortune, but saved my soul. I withdrew from the project and used my own savings to help relocate every single veteran to better facilities. Robert got the contract, made his millions, and never spoke to me again. That's when the whispers started. Robert had influence, connections, the mayor's ear. Suddenly, Harold Whitmore wasn't the reliable partner anymore. I was the unreliable idealist who couldn't be trusted with big projects. Work became scarce. Eleanor and I mortgaged our house 3 times to keep the business afloat. But you know what? We survived. And more importantly, we thrived in ways that couldn't be measured in bank statements. Every Christmas, 47 veteran families sent us cards. Every graduation, former patients from that old hospital invited us to celebrations. Every community crisis, they called Harold Whitmore first because they knew I'd show up with my tools and my heart, ready to help. Eleanor understood. She always understood. "Money comes and goes, Harold," she'd say, running her fingers through my graying hair. "But character lasts forever. We never had children of our own. The Lord had different plans for us, but we became surrogate grandparents to half the neighborhood. I taught countless young people how to use tools, how to solve problems, how to stand up for what's right, even when it costs you everything. That community center became our second home. I installed the basketball hoops, built the stage where generations of children performed their first school plays, and repaired the roof every time a storm tried to tear it down. Eleanor organized bake sales, taught knitting classes, and held more crying children than any woman should have to comfort. When Eleanor passed 3 years ago, I thought my purpose had died with her. The house felt hollow, the silence deafening. I found myself driving to that community center just to feel connected to something larger than my grief. Now, sitting in my quiet living room with Madison Cross's words still ringing in my ears, I realized something profound. She didn't just insult an old man. She attacked everything Eleanor and I had built together, everything we'd sacrificed for, everything we'd loved. And that Cross name wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. As I pulled out my old photo albums, searching for pictures of Robert from our partnership days, one question burned in my mind. What had that family taught their children about Harold Whitmore? And why did it matter enough to hurt me so deeply after all these years? Tomorrow, I would start looking for answers. Tonight, I grieved not just for my wounded pride, but for a community that had forgotten the difference between progress and destruction. The next morning, I woke with a purpose I hadn't felt in months. Something about that young woman's eyes had haunted my dreams, not just their cruelty, but their familiarity. The name Cross echoed in my mind like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing. I made my coffee the way Eleanor used to, strong enough to wake the dead, and sat down at my kitchen table with a box I hadn't opened in 5 years. Inside were contracts, photographs, and correspondence from the old days when Cross and Whitmore Construction was the most respected firm in 3 counties. The first photograph I pulled out nearly made me drop my cup. There was Robert Cross, 28 years old, standing next to me at the groundbreaking ceremony for the Millers Creek Bridge. But it wasn't Robert that made my hands tremble. It was the little girl sitting on his shoulders, maybe 4 years old, with those same piercing eyes that had cut through me the night before. I flipped the photo over, in Eleanor's careful handwriting, Robert with little Madison, 1966. Madison Cross wasn't just any ambitious young developer, she was Robert's granddaughter. My mind raced back through the years, connecting dots I'd been too trusting to see at the time. The way Robert had slowly frozen me out of meetings with important clients. The mysterious delays in payments that always seemed to affect my portions of our contracts. The whispered conversations that stopped when I entered rooms. I spent the next 3 hours going through every document in that box, and a pattern emerged that made my blood run cold. Robert hadn't just abandoned our partnership in 1978. He'd been systematically undermining me for years before that, positioning himself to take over the company entirely. There was a letter from the mayor's office, dated 1977, praising Robert Cross's innovative designs for projects I had personally engineered. Another from the Chamber of Commerce, congratulating Cross Construction for community service initiatives that Eleanor and I had organized and funded. But the most damning evidence was a carbon copy of a letter I was never supposed to see. Robert had written to the Veterans Administration, claiming that I was mentally unstable and possibly suffering from war-related trauma that made me unreliable for government contracts. The betrayal cut deeper than I'd imagined possible. This wasn't just business, this was character assassination designed to destroy everything I'd worked for. I remembered now why I'd never fought back, never tried to clear my name. Eleanor had begged me not to. "Fighting dirty makes you dirty, Harold," she'd said. "Let your work speak for itself." So I had. For 45 years, I'd let my work speak, while Robert Cross rewrote our history. Around noon, I decided to drive downtown to the Cross Development offices. I needed to see this with my own eyes to understand what Robert's legacy had become. The building was sleek glass and steel, everything our old construction office wasn't. In the lobby, a wall of photographs showcased Cross Development's historic projects. I stood there for 20 minutes, studying images of buildings I had designed, bridges I had engineered, community projects I had initiated, all credited to Robert Cross or his company. My hands were shaking again, but this time it wasn't hurt. It was anger. "Can I help you, sir?" A security guard approached, his tone polite but wary. "I'm looking at my life's work," I said quietly, gesturing to the wall, "except someone else's name is on it." The guard looked confused, but before he could respond, I heard a familiar voice behind me. "What are you doing here?" Madison Cross stood near the elevators, her expression a mixture of surprise and irritation. Up close, in the harsh fluorescent light, I could see more of Robert in her features. The sharp jawline, the calculating eyes, the way she held herself like she owned the world. "I'm admiring your family's accomplishments," I said, turning back to the wall of photographs. She stepped closer, following my gaze. For a moment we stood in silence, 2 generations of history between us. "My grandfather built this company from nothing," she said finally, her voice defensive. "Did he?" I asked, pulling out one of the old photographs from my folder, the one of Robert and me breaking ground on the elementary school. "Because I remember it differently." She took the photo, studying it carefully. I watched her face change as she recognized her grandfather, young and ambitious, standing next to a man she'd dismissed as irrelevant. "That's you," she said, and for the first time since I'd met her, uncertainty crept into her voice. That's me, Harold Whitmore. Your grandfather's partner back when Cross and Whitmore built half this town together. I could see her mind working, processing this information, trying to reconcile the fossil she'd insulted with the young engineer in the photograph. He never mentioned a partner, she said quietly. No, I imagine he didn't. I tucked the photograph back into my folder and looked at her one more time. She was still beautiful, still confident, but something had shifted. A crack had appeared in her certainty. Your grandfather was a talented man, Madison, but talent without character is just ambition wearing a fancy suit. As I walked toward the exit, I heard her call after me. What do you want from us? I paused at the door, considering my answer. What did I want? Justice, recognition, revenge. I don't want anything from you, I said finally, but I think you're about to discover you need something from me. As I drove home, I realized that last night's humiliation had been a gift in disguise. It had awakened something in me that I thought had died with Eleanor, the fighter who'd survived Korea, who'd built bridges under impossible conditions, who'd never backed down from doing what was right. Madison Cross thought she knew who Harold Whitmore was, but she was about to learn that some stories have more chapters than you expect, and the most important ones are yet to be written. That night, I couldn't sleep. The weight of 45 years of silence pressed down on my chest like a physical thing. I kept thinking about choices, the ones we make, the ones we avoid, and the prices we pay for both. I found myself in Eleanor's garden at 3 a.m, sitting on the wooden bench I'd built for her 50th birthday. The roses she'd planted were still blooming, somehow thriving even without her tender care. In the moonlight, they looked like ghosts of beauty, holding on long after their gardener had gone. That's when the memories came flooding back, not the sanitized versions I'd been living with, but the raw, honest truth of what those choices had really cost us. It was 1979, 1 year after I'd walked away from Robert's shopping center project. Eleanor was sitting at this very kitchen table, surrounded by bills we couldn't pay, when the phone rang. It was Mrs. Patterson from the bank, calling about our third mortgage payment. "Harold," Eleanor said after hanging up, her voice steady but her hands trembling slightly. "Maybe it's time to reconsider Robert's offer." He'd called twice that week, suggesting I could buy back into the shopping center project for a reduced percentage. It would have solved our financial problems overnight. All I had to do was compromise everything I believed in. I remember looking at my wife, this woman who'd never complained about the second-hand dresses or the delayed vacations or the dreams we'd deferred for principles, and feeling the full weight of my stubbornness. What kind of man would I be, I asked her, if I sold out those veterans for money? Eleanor stood up slowly, walked over to where I sat, and took my rough hands in her soft ones. "You'd be the kind of man who takes care of his wife," she said quietly. "But you'd also be the kind of man I couldn't respect anymore." That was Eleanor. She could break your heart and heal it in the same sentence. We made it through that crisis, barely. I took construction jobs that were beneath my qualifications, worked weekends and holidays, swallowed my pride, and learned to live with less. But we made it through together, and our marriage grew stronger for it. But the real test came 3 years later. In 1982, there was a devastating flood that wiped out half the east side of town. The veterans' housing complex I'd helped build was right in the flood zone. 47 families, men I'd served with, their wives, their children, lost everything in one terrible night. The Red Cross was overwhelmed. FEMA was slow to respond. The city council was more concerned with business district cleanup than helping displaced veterans. That's when I made the choice that would define the rest of my life. I liquidated everything. Our savings, Eleanor's jewelry, the college fund we'd been building even though we didn't have children. I took out loans against the house, borrowed from every friend who'd lend to me, and spent the next 6 months personally coordinating the reconstruction of those 47 homes. I worked 18-hour days in the mud and debris. Eleanor ran a temporary shelter out of the community center, feeding families, organizing clothing drives, holding babies while their mothers cried. We didn't just rebuild houses, we rebuilt hope. Meanwhile, Robert Cross was 15 miles away, constructing his shopping center on schedule and under budget. His company was thriving while I was hemorrhaging money I didn't have for people who couldn't pay me back. The local newspaper ran a small story about the reconstruction effort. One paragraph, buried on page 6, mentioned that local contractor Harold Whitmore was helping with the housing project. The front page featured a full-color photograph of Robert breaking ground on his shopping complex with the headline, "Cross Development Brings Progress to Downtown." I wasn't bitter about the coverage, I truly wasn't, but I was exhausted, financially ruined, and beginning to understand that doing the right thing doesn't always lead to recognition or reward. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in November. I was working late at the Veterans Complex, trying to finish insulation before winter set in, when Eleanor appeared with a thermos of coffee and a look I'd never seen before. "Harold," she said, sitting down on a pile of lumber beside me, "we need to talk." She told me that the bank had called again. We were 3 months behind on our mortgage, and they were starting foreclosure procedures. She'd been hiding the notices, hoping I'd finish the Veterans Project and we could figure something out. "I can ask Robert for a loan," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "No," Eleanor said firmly. "We'll figure out another way." But that night, as we lay in bed listening to the autumn wind rattling our windows, I made a decision that still haunts me. I decided to mortgage our future even further, to risk everything we had left, because those 47 families needed their homes more than Eleanor and I needed financial security. I never told her about the additional loans I took out. I never told her about the sleepless nights I spent calculating and recalculating our debt, trying to find a way to make the numbers work. I never told her how close we came to losing everything, but somehow, miraculously, it all worked out. The veterans got their homes. We kept ours barely. And Eleanor never learned how much we'd really risked. That's the choice I made 43 years ago, to value people over profit, community over comfort, principle over prosperity. Robert Cross made the opposite choice, built an empire on it, and taught his family that success was measured in dollars rather than lives changed. Now, sitting in Eleanor's garden in the early morning darkness, I understood why Madison's words had cut so deeply. She wasn't just insulting an old man, she was dismissing a lifetime of choices made in service to others, choices that her grandfather had never understood and apparently never explained to his family. As the sun began to rise over the roses Eleanor had planted, I made another choice. I was going to show Madison Cross who Harold Whitmore really was, not through words or arguments, but through the lives I'd touched and the community I'd helped build. Some lessons can only be learned through experience, and I had a feeling Madison Cross was about to get an education her grandfather's money couldn't buy. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. I was in my workshop, trying to lose myself in the familiar rhythm of sanding wood, when I heard a hesitant knock on my front door. Through the peephole, I saw a young Hispanic man in his 20s, wearing a cross-development polo shirt and looking nervous as a cat in a thunderstorm. "Mr. Whitmore," he said when I opened the door. "My name is Tommy Rivera. I work for Madison Cross. Could I talk to you for a minute?" I invited him in, offered him coffee, and watched as he fidgeted with his baseball cap like a schoolboy called to the principal's office. "I was at the meeting the other night," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "What Ms. Cross said to you, that wasn't right, sir. That wasn't right at all." Tommy Rivera had kind eyes and calloused hands, the kind of hands that knew honest work. He reminded me of myself at that age, eager and uncertain, trying to find his place in a world that didn't always value decency over dollars. "I've been doing research," he continued, pulling out a tablet loaded with old newspaper articles and photographs. "About you, I mean. About what you've done for this community. Ms. Cross, she doesn't know, does she?" For the next hour, Tommy showed me what he'd discovered. Newspaper clippings from the flood reconstruction, letters to the editor praising my work, Photographs of ribbon-cutting ceremonies where I stood in the background while politicians took credit for projects I'd designed and built. My grandfather lived in the Veterans Housing Complex, Tommy said quietly. Unit 23. He used to tell me stories about the man who rebuilt their homes after the flood, who worked for free and never asked for recognition. He called him El Angel, the angel. My throat tightened. After all these years, to learn that someone remembered, someone understood. Your grandfather was Miguel Rivera, I asked, remembering a proud man with gentle eyes who'd lost his leg in Vietnam. Yes, sir. He passed 5 years ago, but he never forgot what you did. None of them did. Tommy explained that he'd grown up hearing stories about Harold Whitmore, the builder who cared more about people than profit. When he'd gotten the job at Cross Development, he'd hoped to meet me, maybe even work on projects together. He'd had no idea about the history between our families. Ms. Cross thinks she's doing right, he said, his loyalty to his employer warring with his sense of justice. But she doesn't know the whole story. Her grandfather, he painted a very different picture of things. Before Tommy left, he handed me a business card with his personal phone number written on the back. If you need anything, Mr. Whitmore, research, information, anything, you call me. What happened to you isn't right, and it's time people knew the truth. That afternoon brought another surprise. I was working in Eleanor's garden when I heard a car door slam. Looking up, I saw a woman in her 50s walking toward me with the confident stride of someone accustomed to command. "Harold Whitmore," she called out. "I'm Colonel Patricia Hayes, commander of the local VFW post." I stood slowly, brushing dirt from my knees, and shook her firm hand. Colonel Hayes had steel-gray hair, sharp eyes, and the bearing of someone who'd earned every stripe she wore. "I heard about what happened at the community meeting," she said without preamble. "Word travels fast in the veteran community. We don't take kindly to people disrespecting our own." She explained that the VFW had been quietly organizing since Tuesday night. Phone trees had been activated. Social media posts had been shared. The veteran community was rallying around one of their own. "You saved my father's life," she said, her voice growing soft. "Sergeant Major Jim Hayes. You pulled him out of a burning Jeep in Korea, carried him 2 miles to safety with a bullet in your own shoulder." I remembered Jim Hayes, a tough Irish sergeant who'd become one of my closest friends during the war. We'd lost touch over the years, but I'd heard he'd raised a family and lived a good life. "Your father was a fine soldier," I said simply. "He was a fine man because you gave him the chance to become one," she replied. "Dad died 10 years ago, but he never stopped talking about Harold Whitmore. None of us have forgotten what you've done for this community." Colonel Hayes handed me a thick folder filled with letters, dozens of them, from veterans and their families, all praising my work over the decades. Letters I'd never seen, recognition I'd never known existed. "We've been planning to nominate you for the state's Veteran of the Year award," she said. "But after Tuesday night, we've decided to accelerate the process. It's time this community remembered who Harold Whitmore really is." As evening approached, I found myself sitting on my front porch, overwhelmed by the day's revelations. For 45 years, I'd believed my work had gone unnoticed, my sacrifices unappreciated. But Tommy Rivera and Colonel Hayes had shown me something profound, that dignity and service create ripples that spread far beyond what we can see. The phone rang around 8 o'clock. To my surprise, it was my granddaughter Sarah calling from New York. "Grandpa," her voice sounded strained, "I just heard about what happened at the community meeting. Why didn't you call me?" Sarah was Eleanor's sister's daughter, the closest thing to family I had left since my wife's passing. She was a successful corporate lawyer, ambitious and driven, but she'd always felt distant from my simple life. "I didn't want to worry you, sweetheart," I said. "Worry me? Grandpa, I'm flying down this weekend. We need to talk." There was something in her tone that concerned me, something that suggested this wasn't just a supportive granddaughter checking on her elderly grandfather. But I was too tired to probe deeper. As I prepared for bed that night, I reflected on the strange turns my life had taken in just 3 days. Madison Cross had meant to silence an old man who was inconvenient to her plans. Instead, she'd awakened a community that remembered the value of service over self-interest. But I had a feeling the real battles were still to come. Sarah's voice on the phone suggested that not all my allies would come from outside the family, and Tommy's nervous energy reminded me that even well-intentioned young people sometimes faced impossible choices between loyalty and conscience. The story Madison Cross thought was ending was actually just beginning, and tomorrow would bring new chapters that none of us could predict. Sarah arrived on Friday evening, stepping out of her rental car in a designer suit that probably cost more than my monthly pension. She looked like success incarnate, polished, confident, and completely out of place in my modest neighborhood. But when she hugged me, I could feel the tension in her shoulders, the weight of whatever had brought her home. "You look tired, Grandpa," she said, studying my face with the analytical eye she'd inherited from Eleanor's side of the family. "Just old age, sweetheart. Come in. I'll make us some coffee." We sat in the living room where Eleanor's photographs still watched over us from every surface. Sarah fidgeted with her phone, avoiding eye contact in a way that reminded me of Tommy Rivera's nervous energy 2 days earlier. "I've been thinking about your situation," she began, her voice taking on the professional tone she used in courtrooms. "This community center fight, the stress you're under, the way people are treating you." I waited, sensing the carefully rehearsed speech that was coming. "Grandpa, maybe it's time to consider other options. I've been researching some excellent retirement communities in Florida. Sunny weather, activities, people your own age. You'd be happier there." The words hit me like a physical blow. My own granddaughter, the child I taught to ride a bicycle, was suggesting I abandon everything I'd fought for. "Happier?" I repeated quietly. "You're 80 years old, living alone in this big house, fighting battles you can't win against people who don't appreciate you. Why put yourself through this stress?" Sarah pulled out a glossy brochure showing smiling seniors playing shuffleboard and sitting by swimming pools. Paradise for the discarded, where old people went to wait for death while pretending to enjoy themselves. "I've already spoken to a realtor about the house," she continued. "The market is hot right now. We could get top dollar, enough to cover 5 years at a premium facility. You wouldn't have to worry about maintenance, cooking, any of it." I stared at my granddaughter, this accomplished woman who'd built a successful career helping corporations navigate legal challenges, and realized she saw me as just another problem to be solved efficiently. "What about the community center?" I asked. "Grandpa, be realistic. You can't stop progress. These developers have money, lawyers, political connections. You're one old man with outdated ideas about preserving the past." The clinical coldness in her voice reminded me of someone else, and suddenly I understood why Madison Cross's dismissal had felt so familiar. This was the same tone, the same generational arrogance that reduced a lifetime of service to outdated ideas. "I see," I said quietly. Sarah must have sensed my withdrawal because her voice softened slightly. "I'm trying to help you, Grandpa. Aunt Eleanor wouldn't want you to spend your final years fighting losing battles and living in isolation." That's when she crossed the line that couldn't be uncrossed. "Besides," she added, her lawyer's pragmatism taking over completely, "let's be honest about your legacy. You were never as successful as you could have been. You made choices that kept you small, kept you struggling. Maybe it's time to accept that and focus on comfort instead of trying to prove something to people who've already moved on." The silence that followed felt like the moment between lightning and thunder. You know the strike has hit, but you're waiting for the devastating sound. I looked around my living room, at Eleanor's knitting basket still sitting by her favorite chair, at the photographs documenting 60 years of community service, at the handmade furniture I'd crafted with love and patience. Then I looked at Sarah, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time. "You're ashamed of me," I said. It wasn't a question. That's not, "You're ashamed of your grandfather who never made millions, who chose community over cash, who lives in a modest house instead of a mansion. You think I'm a failure." Sarah's face flushed, but she didn't deny it. That silence told me everything I needed to know. When your friends in New York ask about your family, you probably don't mention your grandfather, the small-town contractor. You probably say I'm retired and leave it at that. A dog, Grandpa, please. Do you know what I did yesterday, Sarah? I learned that 47 families still send Christmas cards to this house because I helped rebuild their homes after a flood. I learned that veterans I served with in Korea still tell their children stories about Harold Whitmore. I learned that young people I've never met know my name because their grandfathers called me El Angel. I stood up slowly, my joints protesting, but my resolve strengthening. You measure success in dollars and professional recognition. I measure it in lives touched and communities built. We're using different mathematics, sweetheart, and I'm not sure we'll ever reach the same answer. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but whether from shame or frustration, I couldn't tell. I just want you to be safe and comfortable, she whispered. I want to be useful and purposeful, I replied. Those aren't the same things. The worst part was seeing the genuine love in her eyes, tangled up with embarrassment and what she believed was practical wisdom. She wasn't cruel like Madison Cross. She was trying to help, but her help felt like betrayal because it required me to abandon everything I'd lived for. After Sarah went to bed in Eleanor's old sewing room, I sat on the front porch until nearly midnight, wondering how I'd failed to communicate my values to the one person who should have understood them best. Tommy Rivera's support felt more genuine than my own granddaughter's love. Colonel Hayes and the veteran community saw my worth more clearly than my own flesh and blood. Strangers honored my legacy while my family wanted to bury it in a Florida retirement home. But the deepest cut was realizing that Sarah's shame wasn't entirely unfounded. By society's standards, I had failed. I'd chosen service over success, principle over profit, community over personal advancement. In a world that measured worth by wealth, Harold Whitmore was indeed a small, forgotten man. The question that kept me awake wasn't whether I'd made the right choices. I knew I had. The question was whether those choices mattered to anyone who shared my blood, or if I was truly as alone as Madison Cross believed I was. Tomorrow would bring more revelations, more challenges, more opportunities to defend a way of life that fewer and fewer people seemed to value. But tonight, I grieved for a granddaughter who'd inherited Eleanor's intelligence, but not her heart, and for a legacy that meant everything to me, but seemed to embarrass the people I loved most. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I found myself in the basement at 3 a.m, surrounded by boxes of memories I'd been avoiding since Eleanor's death. Sarah's words echoed in my mind like a broken record. You were never as successful as you could have been. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was just a foolish old man clinging to outdated notions of honor and service. I pulled out a wooden crate filled with Eleanor's personal belongings, things I hadn't been able to face for 3 years. Her reading glasses, still folded neatly in their case. Her favorite coffee mug with the chip on the handle that she refused to let me fix. And underneath it all, a manila envelope with my name written in her careful script. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside were letters, dozens of them, all addressed to me but in Eleanor's handwriting. Letters she'd written but never sent, dated over the course of our final year together. The first one was dated 6 months before her death. My dearest Harold, I know you'll find these someday, probably when you're feeling lost and doubting yourself. I've been watching you lately, seeing the weight you carry, the way you question whether our choices were the right ones. I need you to know something, even if I never find the courage to say it while I'm here with you. I had to stop reading. The basement suddenly felt suffocating, her voice so clear in those words that I could almost hear her speaking them aloud. You think I don't know about the sacrifices you made. You think I never noticed the extra jobs you took, the meals you skipped, the dreams you deferred so we could help others. But I saw everything, Harold. I saw you give away your last dollar to families who needed it more than we did. I saw you work until your hands bled because you believed in building something lasting and good. The tears came without warning, 43 years of unspoken gratitude pouring out of my wife's words. Do you remember when Mrs. Chen's grandson needed surgery and she couldn't afford it? You told me the construction job in Springfield fell through, but I knew better. I knew you gave her that money we needed for our own roof repair. We spent that winter with buckets catching rainwater, but Jimmy Chen lived because of your generosity. I remembered that winter. I remembered Eleanor never complaining about the leaks, never questioning my story about the lost contract. She'd known the truth all along. You think you failed because we never had children, because we never built the fortune that Robert Cross accumulated. But Harold, you raised this entire community. Every child you taught to use tools, every veteran you helped find work, every family you sheltered during hard times, they were all our children. The next letter was even more devastating. I'm scared, Harold. Not of dying. I've made my peace with that. I'm scared that when I'm gone, you'll forget who you are. You'll listen to people who measure worth in bank statements and stock portfolios. You'll start believing that a life spent in service to others is somehow less valuable than a life spent accumulating wealth. Eleanor had seen Sarah's visit coming 23 years before it happened. Promise me something, my love. Promise me you won't let anyone convince you to become small in your final years. Promise me you won't trade your purpose for comfort, your convictions for convenience. The world needs more Harold Whitmores, not fewer. Now I sat there in my basement, surrounded by the debris of 8 decades of living, reading my wife's final thoughts by the light of a bare bulb. She'd written about our financial struggles, our childlessness, our modest home, and every word celebrated rather than mourned these supposed failures. You ask me sometimes if I regret marrying you instead of someone more ambitious, someone who could have given me an easier life. The answer is no, Harold. 1,000 times no. I'd rather spend 50 years worrying about money with a man of integrity than 50 years counting money with a man of questionable character. But it was the final letter that broke me completely. I've been diagnosed with congestive heart failure. I haven't told you yet because I know you'll blame yourself, know you'll think the stress of our financial struggles contributed to my condition. But Harold, listen to me carefully. I am dying with a heart full of love and pride, not regret. My heart is failing not because of hardship, but because it's been so full for so many years that it simply wore out from loving. I've watched you choose compassion over comfort every single day of our marriage. I've seen you sacrifice personal gain for communal good so many times that I've lost count. My heart is failing because it's been stretched beyond its physical limits by admiration for the man I married. When people remember Eleanor Whitmore, they won't remember her jewelry or her clothes or her house. They'll remember that she was married to Harold Whitmore, the man who built bridges, not just of steel and concrete, but between people, between generations, between hope and despair. I wept then like I hadn't wept since the day we buried her. Not just for Eleanor, but for the doubt that had been poisoning my spirit since Tuesday night, for the shame that Sarah's words had awakened, for the question that had been haunting me, whether a life of service mattered in a world that valued only success. Eleanor had answered that question before I'd even thought to ask it. As dawn broke over our quiet neighborhood, I climbed the basement stairs with my wife's letters clutched against my chest. Sarah was in the kitchen, dressed for travel, her suitcase by the door. "I have an early flight," she said without looking at me. "I've left the retirement community brochures on the table. Just think about it, okay?" I wanted to share Eleanor's letters with her, to help her understand what she was asking me to abandon. But some lessons can't be taught through words alone. "I love you, Sarah," I said simply, "but I'm not ready to stop being Harold Whitmore yet." She nodded, kissed my cheek with the distant affection reserved for stubborn elderly relatives, and left. I spent that morning in Eleanor's garden, reading her letters again while her roses bloomed around me. The community center battle suddenly seemed less important than the larger war for my own soul, the fight between the Harold Whitmore that Eleanor had loved and the diminished version that everyone else seemed to expect. By noon, I'd made a decision that would have surprised my granddaughter and terrified my enemies. Instead of retreating into the comfortable invisibility of old age, I was going to fight harder than ever. Not just for a building, but for the idea that service matters more than success, that character trumps cash, that some stories are worth telling even when the world has stopped listening. Madison Cross had called me a fossil. Sarah had suggested I was a failure, but Eleanor's words reminded me that some fossils become foundations, and some failures become legends. The war for my community was about to begin in earnest, and Harold Whitmore was ready to surprise everyone who'd underestimated him. Monday morning brought an unexpected discovery that would change everything. I was organizing Eleanor's sewing room. Sarah's visit had motivated me to finally tackle the spaces I'd been avoiding when I found something that made my blood run cold. Hidden behind Eleanor's fabric collection was a manila envelope marked "For Harold's Eyes Only" in handwriting I didn't recognize. Inside was a collection of documents that painted a picture so shocking I had to sit down to process it all. The first document was a hospital record from 1994, showing that a 5-year-old girl named Madison Cross had been treated for severe injuries after falling through ice on Miller's Creek. But what made my hands tremble was the incident report attached to it, describing how an unidentified civilian had pulled the child from the frozen water and performed CPR until paramedics arrived. The description of that civilian matched me perfectly, down to the old Navy peacoat I'd worn that winter and the distinctive scar on my left hand from Korea, but I had no memory of saving Madison Cross's life. The next document was a copy of a newspaper article I'd never seen, dated December 15th, 1994. The headline read, "Local Hero Saves Child from Drowning." The article described how Harold Whitmore had risked his own life to save a young girl who'd fallen through thin ice while playing near the bridge I'd designed 20 years earlier. According to the article, I'd been driving home from a construction site when I heard screaming. I'd crawled onto the unstable ice, pulled the unconscious child to safety, and performed mouth-to-mouth resuscitation for nearly 10 minutes before she started breathing again. The paramedics said another 2 minutes and she would have died. But the most shocking part was a quote attributed to the child's father. "Mr. Whitmore saved my daughter's life. Our family will never forget this debt." The father was identified as Robert Cross Jr., Madison's father and Robert Sr.'s son. How could I not remember something so significant? Then I found the answer in the final document, my own medical records from that same day. Apparently, the shock of the cold water and the physical exertion had triggered a mild heart episode. I'd been hospitalized for 3 days and had suffered what the doctors called selective amnesia related to the traumatic event. Eleanor had kept these records hidden from me for 29 years. There was a note in her handwriting attached to the hospital paperwork. Harold blamed himself for not building better safety barriers around the bridge. The doctors said remembering might trigger another heart episode. Some acts of heroism are their own reward, even when the hero can't remember them. I sat in that sewing room, holding proof that I'd saved Madison Cross's life when she was 5 years old, and she had no idea. Her family knew. They'd always known. But somehow, in the years that followed, that debt of gratitude had been transformed into resentment and eventual hostility. I had to know why. That afternoon, I drove to the Cross Development offices with the documents in my folder. This time, I wasn't coming as a supplicant or an adversary. I was coming as the man who'd given Madison Cross the gift of life itself. The same security guard from my previous visit looked surprised to see me again. "I need to speak with Madison Cross," I said firmly. "Tell her Harold Whitmore is here about December 15th, 1994. 20 minutes later, I was sitting in a conference room with polished wood and windows overlooking the downtown I'd helped build. Madison entered, looking composed and professional, but I caught a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes when she saw the manila envelope in my hands. "Mr. Whitmore," she said coolly, "I'm not sure what we have to discuss." I opened the envelope and spread the documents across the conference table like evidence in a courtroom. Her hospital records, the newspaper article, the medical reports. I watched her face change as she recognized the paperwork, saw her name on the hospital bracelet photo, read the details of an event that had shaped her entire existence. "You fell through the ice at Miller's Creek when you were 5 years old," I said quietly. "Someone pulled you out and saved your life." Madison picked up the newspaper article with trembling hands, reading the account of her own rescue. When she looked up, her eyes were wide with something between shock and recognition. "I remember the cold," she whispered. "I remember the darkness, but I never knew. They never told me who." "Your father knew. Your grandfather knew. According to this article, your father said your family would never forget the debt." She stared at the documents, her composure finally cracking. "My grandfather never mentioned your name without contempt. He said you were unreliable, unstable, someone who couldn't be trusted with important projects. And yet he never mentioned that I saved his granddaughter's life." Madison was quiet for a long time, processing the implications of what she'd learned. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "Why didn't you ever tell me? When I said those things at the meeting, why didn't you use this?" "Because I didn't remember," I said honestly. "The trauma caused selective amnesia. My wife kept these records hidden from me for almost 30 years. I only found them this morning." She picked up the hospital photo, showing her as a small, unconscious child, surrounded by medical equipment. "I could have died. You did die, technically, for 90 seconds, according to the paramedics report. But sometimes people get second chances." Madison Cross, the woman who'd called me a fossil, who'd dismissed me as irrelevant, was staring at proof that she owed her entire existence to the man she'd tried to humiliate. "I don't understand," she said finally. "If you saved my life, if my family knew about it, why did my grandfather hate you so much?" That was the question I'd been asking myself all day. Why would Robert Cross spend decades destroying the reputation of the man who'd saved his granddaughter's life? "I think," I said carefully, "that your grandfather was a man who couldn't bear to owe anyone anything, especially someone whose principles he couldn't understand or respect." Madison was crying now, tears falling onto the newspaper article that described her 5-year-old self being pulled back from death. "All these years," she whispered, "I thought you were the enemy. I thought you were standing in the way of progress, holding back development out of stubbornness and nostalgia. What do you think now?" She looked up at me with eyes that were seeing Harold Whitmore clearly for the first time in her adult life. "I think," she said slowly, "that I've been carrying my grandfather's grudges without understanding their source. And I think I owe you more than an apology." As I gathered the documents and prepared to leave, Madison called out to me, "Mr. Whitmore, that little girl you saved, what would you want her to do with the life you gave back to her?" I paused at the conference room door, considering the question that would define everything that came next. "I'd want her to use it to build something lasting and good," I said. "Something that helps people instead of displacing them. Something her 5-year-old self would be proud of when she grew up." Bidadis, as I walked out of the Cross Development building for the second time, I realized that the most powerful revelations aren't always the ones we seek. Sometimes they're the ones that find us when we're ready to understand their meaning. Madison Cross now knew she was alive because of Harold Whitmore. The question was, what was she going to do with that knowledge? The confrontation I'd been dreading finally came 3 days later, but not in the way I'd expected. I was working in my garden Thursday morning when Tommy Rivera's car screeched into my driveway. He jumped out, his face pale with worry, clutching a manila envelope that looked suspiciously similar to the one I'd carried to Madison's office. "Mr. Whitmore," he called out, jogging toward me. "We need to talk right now." I invited him into the kitchen and poured coffee while he paced like a caged animal, clearly struggling with something that was eating him alive. "I've been doing more research," he began, his voice tight with tension, "about your partnership with Robert Cross, about what really happened between you two." He spread documents across my kitchen table, Bank records, correspondence, legal papers that I'd never seen before, papers that painted a picture so ugly I could barely comprehend it. "I found these in my supervisor's files," Tommy said. "I wasn't supposed to see them. But when Ms. Cross asked me to research the community center property, I came across some old legal documents that didn't make sense." The first document was a property deed from 1978, showing that Robert Cross had somehow gained sole ownership of 3 valuable parcels of land that Cross and Whitmore Construction had purchased together, land that should have been split equally between partners. "He forged your signature," Tommy said quietly. "Look at this purchase agreement from 1977, then look at this transfer of ownership from 1978. The signatures don't match." I studied the documents with a growing sense of nausea. Robert hadn't just stolen credit for my work. He'd literally stolen my property, forged legal documents to cut me out of deals worth millions. "There's more," Tommy continued, his hands shaking as he pointed to a bank statement. "This account shows payments made to city officials, planning commissioners, zoning board members. Your former partner was buying approvals for developments while making sure your projects got delayed or denied." The scope of Robert's betrayal was breathtaking. For years, I'd believed that my principled stance on the Veterans Hospital had cost me business opportunities. In reality, Robert had been systematically destroying my reputation while bribing officials to ensure his own success. "Mr. Whitmore," Tommy said, his voice barely a whisper, "according to these documents, you should have been worth millions. The land he stole from you, the projects he diverted to his own company, the contracts he manipulated. You should have been one of the wealthiest men in this town." I sat in silence, processing the magnitude of what I was learning. Every financial struggle Eleanor and I had endured, every sacrifice we'd made, every humble choice that had defined our lives, all of it could have been different if not for my partner's systematic theft and fraud. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked finally. Tommy's expression shifted to something between guilt and determination. "Because Ms. Cross doesn't know. She's been raised on her grandfather's version of events, believing you were the failed partner who couldn't handle success. But she deserves to know the truth, especially after—" He paused, clearly wrestling with information he wasn't supposed to have. "After what, Tommy?" "After she found out you saved her life," he said quietly. "She's been different since Monday, questioning everything. She cancelled the community center demolition and has been locked in her office for 3 days, going through old family papers." My heart began to race. Madison was investigating her grandfather's legacy, which meant she might discover the same ugly truths that Tommy had uncovered. "There's something else," Tommy continued reluctantly. "Ms. Cross asked me to arrange a meeting with you for tonight, 7 o'clock at the community center. She said she needs to discuss something important about the property." An hour after Tommy left, I received a phone call that chilled me to the bone. "Harold Whitmore?" The voice was crisp, professional, unfamiliar. "This is Harold. My name is James Cross. I'm Madison's father, Robert Jr.'s son. I believe you and my daughter have been having some conversations about family history." Robert Jr., the man whose daughter I'd saved from drowning 29 years ago, a man who'd grown up hearing his father's version of events, believing Harold Whitmore was an enemy rather than a hero. "We've spoken, yes. I think it's time we had a conversation ourselves, Mr. Whitmore. Face to face, man to man." There was something in his tone that suggested this wouldn't be a friendly chat, something that made me understand why Madison had seemed so conflicted in recent days. "I'll be at the community center tonight at 7, I said. "So will I," James replied. "And Mr. Whitmore, I think you should prepare yourself for some uncomfortable truths about the past." The line went dead, leaving me to wonder what new revelations awaited me. That evening, I arrived at the community center early, letting myself in with the key I'd carried for 40 years. The building felt different in the twilight, not just empty, but haunted by memories of all the lives that had intersected within these walls. I was standing in the main hall, looking at the stage where Eleanor had directed countless children's plays. when I heard footsteps echoing from the entrance. Multiple sets of footsteps. Madison entered first, her face pale and drawn, followed by a man in his 50s who could only be her father. James Cross had Robert Sr.'s sharp features, but none of his superficial charm. Behind them came Tommy Rivera, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. "Mr. Whitmore," Madison said, her voice strained, "thank you for coming." James Cross stepped forward, and I could see the internal war playing out across his features. Gratitude wrestling with a lifetime of resentment, truth battling against family loyalty. "My daughter tells me you saved her life when she was 5, he said without preamble. "I did. And she tells me you have questions about my father's business practices." "I have answers," I corrected. "The question is whether you're ready to hear them." For the next hour, in the building where Eleanor and I had celebrated our first dance as newlyweds, 3 generations of the Cross family learned the truth about Robert Cross Sr.'s systematic betrayal of his business partner. Tommy presented his evidence methodically: the forged documents, the bribery records, the stolen property. Madison sat in stunned silence as her grandfather's legacy crumbled before her eyes. But James Cross's reaction surprised me most of all. "I knew," he said quietly when Tommy finished his presentation. "Not the details, not the extent of it, but I knew my father had done something terrible to you." Madison stared at her father in shock. "You knew? Why do you think I moved to California after college? Why do you think I stayed away from the family business for 20 years? I couldn't prove what he'd done, but I knew Harold Whitmore wasn't the villain my father painted him to be." James looked directly at me, his eyes filled with decades of suppressed guilt. "When you saved Madison's life, I wanted to tell you the truth then. I wanted to apologize for my father's crimes, to try to make amends somehow, but he threatened to disinherit Madison if I ever contacted you. He said the family's reputation was more important than one man's hurt feelings." "So you stayed silent," I said. "I stayed silent, and I've regretted it every day for 29 years. The community center fell quiet, except for the sound of Madison Cross weeping for a grandfather she'd revered and a legacy built on lies. "What happens now?" she asked through her tears. I looked around the building that had been my second home for half a century, at the stage where Eleanor had taught children to dream, at the walls that had sheltered countless community gatherings. "Now," I said, "we decide what kind of people we want to be going forward. We can't change the past, but we can still choose how this story ends." The meeting that was supposed to be about property had become something much more significant, a reckoning with truth that would determine whether the Cross family's future would be built on the same foundation of lies that had defined their past. The silence in the community center stretched on for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. Madison sat hunched over in one of the old metal folding chairs, her grandfather's crimes spread out before her in black and white. James paced near the windows, decades of suppressed guilt finally finding its voice. Tommy stood by the door like he was ready to flee at any moment. I was the one who finally broke the silence. "There's something else you all need to know," I said, my voice echoing in the empty hall. "Something that might help you understand why your grandfather did what he did." I pulled out a letter I'd found among Eleanor's hidden papers, one I hadn't shown to anyone, not even Tommy. It was dated 1979, written in Robert Cross Sr.'s own handwriting, addressed to me, but never sent. "I found this in my wife's belongings. Apparently your grandfather wrote it, but never had the courage to mail it." Madison looked up through her tears. "What does it say?" I unfolded the letter carefully, its edges yellow with age, and began to read aloud. "Harold, I know you'll never read this because I'm too much of a coward to send it, but I need to write these words, even if they'll never leave this desk drawer. You saved my granddaughter's life today. When I got that call from the hospital, when they told me Madison had fallen through the ice and that someone had pulled her out, I knew it was you before they even said your name. Of course it was you. Harold Whitmore, always there when people need help, always doing the right thing without thought of reward or recognition. James stopped pacing and turned to face me, his expression shifting from guilt to something approaching understanding. I've spent 20 years trying to destroy you professionally because I couldn't stand living in your shadow morally. Every project we worked on together, every community service initiative, every moment of crisis, you were the one people turned to, the one they trusted, the one they respected. Not because you sought their admiration, but because you earned it through consistent decency. Madison wiped her eyes and sat up straighter, hanging on every word. I told myself that your principles were naive, that your choices were impractical, that your refusal to compromise was just stubbornness. But the truth is simpler and more painful. You were the better man, and I couldn't bear the comparison. When you walked away from the shopping center project to protect those veterans, I should have admired your integrity. Instead, I saw an opportunity to finally surpass you, to prove that my way, the practical way, the profitable way, was superior to your idealistic approach. Tommy moved closer, his young face reflecting the shock we all felt at Robert's unexpected honesty. I've stolen from you, Harold. Not just money and property, though I've done that too. I've stolen credit for your work, recognition for your achievements, respect that you earned through service. I've poisoned people against you through carefully planted lies and deliberate omissions. But today, when you saved Madison's life without hesitation, without thought of our professional conflicts or personal animosity, I realized the futility of my campaign against you. You can't diminish a truly good man by spreading lies about him. You can only diminish yourself. My voice caught as I read the final paragraph. I will never send this letter because doing so would require me to admit that everything I've built is based on a foundation of envy and deceit. My success, my reputation, my family's future, all of it exists because I destroyed a better man than myself. Some truths are too terrible to acknowledge, even to oneself. But I want you to know, Harold Whitmore, that in saving my granddaughter's life, you proved once again that you are exactly the man I always feared you were. Someone whose worth can't be measured in dollars or diminished by lies. Someone whose legacy will outlast mine, regardless of how much money I accumulate or how much damage I do to your reputation. Madison will grow up in a world shaped by your bridges, educated in schools you designed, living in a community you helped build. And someday, when she's old enough to understand the difference between success and significance, she'll realize that Harold Whitmore's fingerprints are on everything good in her life. I folded the letter and placed it gently on the table beside the other documents. The community center was completely silent except for the sound of Madison crying, not the frustrated tears of earlier, but something deeper and more healing. He knew, she whispered. He knew exactly what he was doing to you, and he did it anyway. James sat down heavily in the chair next to his daughter. The worst part is that he was right about you, Harold. Everything good in our lives, everything meaningful about this community, you had a hand in building it. Your grandfather wasn't evil, I said quietly. He was human, flawed, ambitious, jealous, but human. We all make choices, and those choices define who we become. Madison looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. How can you defend him after what he did to you? Because, I said, settling into a chair across from her, anger is a poison you drink hoping someone else will die. I've lived 80 years, Madison. I've learned that holding grudges hurts the grudge holder more than anyone else. Tommy finally spoke up from his position by the door. But don't you want justice? Don't you want them to pay for what was stolen from you? It was a fair question, one I'd been asking myself since discovering the truth about Robert's betrayal. What would justice look like, Tommy? Robert Cross Sr. is dead. The money is spent. The property is developed. The only people left to punish are his children and grandchildren who inherited his lies along with his wealth. I looked directly at Madison and James. But there's something more valuable than justice. There's redemption. There's the opportunity to take a legacy built on lies and transform it into something built on truth. Madison leaned forward, her business instincts engaging despite her emotional turmoil. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that the Cross family has a choice to make. You can continue living with your grandfather's version of history, or you can write a new chapter that honors the truth. You can keep the wealth he accumulated through betrayal, or you can use it to heal the damage he caused. You want us to give you money? James asked, not accusingly, but with genuine curiosity. I don't want your money, I said firmly. I want your conscience. I want you to look at this community center, at the families your grandfather's developments displaced, at the legacy of service he tried to erase, and decide what kind of people you want to be going forward. Madison stood up and walked to the windows overlooking the neighborhood she'd planned to transform through demolition and development. The streetlights were coming on, illuminating the modest homes where working families lived, the sidewalks where children played, the community that had existed long before cross-development and would hopefully exist long after. My grandfather saved every letter of praise he ever received, she said finally. His office is full of awards and recognitions and newspaper clippings celebrating his achievements. But do you know what I've never seen? She turned back to face us. I've never seen a single letter from someone whose life he changed for the better. Not one photograph of him helping a family in crisis. Not one story about Robert Cross Sr. making a personal sacrifice for the greater good. What are you saying, Madison? Her father asked. I'm saying that when I die, I don't want to leave behind a wall full of awards that nobody remembers. I want to leave behind a community full of people whose lives were better because I was here. As we prepared to leave the community center that night, I realized that the most important confrontation hadn't been between me and the Cross family. It had been between their past and their future, between the legacy they'd inherited and the one they could choose to create. The building that Madison had planned to demolish had become the place where she'd finally learned the difference between success and significance. And for the first time since Eleanor's death, I felt hope that the next generation might choose to build bridges instead of walls. The next morning brought a phone call that would test every principle I'd lived by for 80 years. Mr. Whitmore, this is Dr. Patricia Martinez from Mercy General Hospital. We have Madison Cross here in our cardiac unit. She's asking for you. My hands shook as I gripped the phone. What happened? She collapsed at her office early this morning. Stress-induced heart episode, similar to what you experienced back in 1994. She's stable now, but she's been asking for you specifically. She says there's something she needs to tell you before she loses her courage. I drove to the hospital with Tommy Rivera, who'd arrived at my house shortly after the doctor's call. His face was pale with worry and something that looked like guilt. This is my fault, he said as we navigated through morning traffic. I should never have shown her those documents, the shock of learning about her grandfather's crimes, the weight of what her family owes you. It was too much. The truth doesn't cause heart attacks, Tommy, I replied gently. Carrying lies for too long does. We found Madison in a private room, looking small and fragile in the hospital bed. Machines beeped softly around her, monitoring the heart that had given out under the weight of revelations she couldn't bear. James sat beside her, holding her hand with the desperate grip of a father who'd already lost too much to family secrets. Harold, she whispered when she saw me, I'm so sorry for everything. For what I said at the meeting, for what my grandfather did to you, for the years you've suffered because of my family's lies. I pulled a chair close to her bedside. Save your strength, Madison. Apologies can wait until you're well. No, she said firmly, struggling to sit up despite her father's protests. They can't wait, because what I'm about to ask you, it might be the last conversation we ever have. She reached for a manila envelope on her bedside table, her movements weak but determined. I spent all night going through my grandfather's private papers, documents he kept locked in a safe that I'd never seen before. Harold, the scope of what he stole from you, it's even worse than we thought. The envelope contained property deeds, bank statements, and legal documents showing that Robert Cross Sr. had systematically stolen not just millions in property and contracts, but had also manipulated city planning decisions to devalue land I owned, while artificially inflating the value of his own holdings. According to these documents, Madison continued, her voice growing stronger with each revelation, you should own half of downtown, including the land where Cross Development headquarters sits today. I studied the papers, feeling a familiar numbness that came with understanding the true magnitude of Robert's betrayal. Not only had he stolen my partnership share, but he'd orchestrated a decades-long campaign of financial manipulation that had cost me tens of millions of dollars. There's more, Madison said, pulling out a thick legal document. This is his will, the real one, not the version that was filed for probate. He left instructions for his family about how to handle the Whitmore problem if you ever discovered the truth. James looked sick as his daughter read from their father's final betrayal. If Harold Whitmore ever produces evidence of our past business dealings, the family must discredit him through any means necessary. His age and isolation make him vulnerable to claims of mental instability. A few well-placed suggestions about dementia or delusions should be sufficient to protect the family's interests. He planned to destroy your reputation even from the grave, Madison whispered, tears streaming down her face. He was going to have us declare you mentally incompetent if you ever fought back. The cruel efficiency of Robert's final manipulation took my breath away. Even in death, he'd tried to ensure that Harold Whitmore could never challenge the Cross family's version of history. But here's what he didn't plan for, Madison continued, her voice gaining strength. He didn't plan for his granddaughter to discover that you saved her life. He didn't plan for his son to grow up feeling guilty about the family's crimes. And he didn't plan for his legacy to be inherited by people who still had consciences. She struggled to reach into the envelope again, pulling out a single sheet of paper that she handed to me with trembling fingers. This is a transfer deed for every piece of property my grandfather stole from you, plus interest calculated at current market rates. The total value is approximately $47 million. The room fell silent except for the steady beeping of Madison's heart monitor. Tommy sat down heavily in the corner chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what we were discussing. Madison, I said gently, you can't just give away your family's entire fortune. It's not our fortune, she replied firmly. It's yours. It always was. We've been living on stolen money for 45 years. James leaned forward, his face etched with the pain of a man confronting a lifetime of inherited guilt. She's right, Harold. Everything we have, everything we've built, it all started with what my father took from you. I looked at the deed in my hands, a document that would make me one of the wealthiest men in the state, that would vindicate every sacrifice Eleanor and I had made, that would prove to Sarah and everyone else that Harold Whitmore had been successful by any measure. But as I sat in that hospital room, watching a young woman destroy her health, trying to atone for her grandfather's sins, I realized that some victories cost more than they're worth. I can't accept this, I said, placing the deed back on Madison's bedside table. What? Tommy jumped up from his chair. Mr. Whitmore, this is rightfully yours. This is justice. No, Tommy. Justice would have been Robert Cross admitting his crimes 40 years ago and making amends while he was alive. This isn't justice. This is punishment being visited on innocent people who inherited guilt they didn't earn. Madison struggled to sit up straighter, her face flushed with determination. But we did earn it, Harold. We earned it by benefiting from his crimes, by living comfortable lives while you struggled, by believing his lies about your character. You were 5 years old when this started, Madison. Your father was in his 20s, trying to build his own life. Neither of you chose your grandfather's actions. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city I'd helped build, but never truly owned. Besides, I continued, what would I do with $47 million at 80 years old? Buy a bigger house to be lonely in? Hire more people to take care of me? Purchase validation I don't need from people whose opinions don't matter? Then what do you want? James asked desperately. There has to be something we can do to make this right. I turned back to face them, these three people whose lives had become entangled with mine through decades of secrets and lies. I want you to use that money to build something that lasts, I said. I want you to transform cross-development from a company that displaces communities into one that strengthens them. I want you to take your grandfather's legacy of greed and turn it into a legacy of service. Madison's heart monitor began beeping faster as she processed what I was suggesting. You want us to become the kind of company you would have built, she said quietly. I want you to become the kind of people you were meant to be before your grandfather's crimes defined your family's path. As I prepared to leave the hospital, Madison called out to me one last time, Harold, if we do this, if we try to build something good from the wreckage of my grandfather's legacy, will you help us? Will you teach us how to measure success the way you and Eleanor did? I paused at the door, considering the irony of the situation. The woman who'd called me a fossil was asking me to mentor her transformation from everything I'd opposed into everything I'd always believed in. Get well first, I said. Then we'll talk about building bridges instead of walls. Ooh. As Tommy and I drove home from the hospital, I realized that the most important choice I'd made in decades hadn't been about accepting or rejecting money. It had been about choosing redemption over revenge, transformation over retribution. Eleanor would have been proud. Madison was released from the hospital 3 days later, but the real recovery began the moment she walked into the cross-development offices with a new purpose burning in her eyes. I know this because Tommy called me every few hours with updates, his voice alternating between excitement and terror as he watched his boss dismantle her grandfather's empire piece by piece. Mr. Whitmore, he said during one particularly frantic call, she's lost her mind. She just cancelled 6 major development projects and told the board she's restructuring the entire company. They're talking about having her declared incompetent. I wasn't surprised. Transforming a legacy built on greed into one based on service was never going to be easy, especially when millions of dollars in contracts were at stake. Is she asking for help? I inquired. She's asking for you, Tommy replied. She wants to meet at the community center tonight. She says she has a proposition that will either save both our careers or destroy them completely. That evening, I arrived at the community center to find Madison standing at the old piano where Eleanor used to accompany the children's choir. She looked different, thinner from her hospital stay, but somehow stronger, as if confronting the truth about her family had lifted a weight she didn't know she'd been carrying. Harold, she said without turning around, do you know what this building really represents? I joined her at the piano, running my fingers over the keys that Eleanor's hands had touched thousands of times. It represents community, I said simply. No, Madison replied, finally facing me. It represents the choice between 2 different ways of measuring worth. My grandfather saw a building that generated no profit, served no economic purpose, occupied valuable real estate that could be better utilized. You see a place where lives were touched, relationships were built, community was strengthened. She pulled out a thick folder and spread its contents across the piano's surface. Architectural drawings, financial projections, construction timelines. I've spent the last 3 days designing something that honors both perspectives, she continued. A project that generates sustainable profit while serving community needs. A development that creates value without destroying what already exists. The drawing showed a mixed-use complex surrounding the preserved community center. Affordable housing for seniors and young families, commercial space for local businesses, green areas for recreation, and a medical clinic providing free services to veterans. The community center becomes the heart of a neighborhood designed for people instead of cars, for relationships instead of transactions, for long-term sustainability instead of short-term profit. I studied the plans with growing amazement. Madison had essentially redesigned urban development around the principles Eleanor and I had lived by, putting community needs at the center while finding ways to make the economics work. This is brilliant, I admitted, but it's also expensive. Where will you get the funding for something this ambitious? Madison smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her since our confrontation began. From the $47 million you refused to accept, she said. I'm establishing the Eleanor Whitmore Foundation for Community Development, using the money my grandfather stole from you to fund projects that honor your wife's memory and your shared values. The gesture took my breath away. Not just the money, though that was staggering, but the recognition of Eleanor's role in shaping my principles, the understanding that our partnership had been the foundation of everything good I'd accomplished. There's more, Madison continued, pulling out additional documents. I'm donating the Cross-Development Headquarters building to the city for use as a Veteran Services Center. Tommy will run the day-to-day operations of the foundation, and I want you to chair the board of directors. Madison, I said slowly, this is your family's entire fortune. What will you live on? I'm keeping enough for a modest salary and a small apartment, she replied. Everything else goes toward undoing the damage my grandfather caused and building the kind of community you and Eleanor always envisioned. Tommy appeared in the doorway, looking simultaneously thrilled and terrified. The board is meeting in emergency session tomorrow morning, he announced. They're going to try to remove you as CEO, Madison. They're claiming you've had some kind of breakdown since the hospital stay. Madison nodded calmly, as if she'd expected this development. Let them try, she said. I control 51% of company stock, inherited directly from my grandfather. They can complain, but they can't stop me. They can make your life very difficult, I warned. Changing a corporate culture built on profit maximization isn't something you can accomplish overnight, which is why I need your help, Madison said, turning to face me directly. I need someone who understands the difference between success and significance, someone who spent a lifetime building community instead of destroying it. I looked around the community center where Eleanor and I had celebrated our wedding anniversary every year, where we taught Sunday school and organized disaster relief and held countless meetings to solve neighborhood problems. The building that Madison's grandfather had wanted to demolish, that she'd planned to replace with a shopping plaza, that had become the unlikely catalyst for redemption neither of us had seen coming. Harold, Madison said quietly, I know I have no right to ask this after what my family put you through, but I'm asking anyway. Will you help me transform cross-development into the kind of company you would have built? Will you help me use my grandfather's stolen fortune to heal the damage he caused? Through the community center windows, I could see the neighborhood lights twinkling in the darkness, families gathered around dinner tables, children doing homework, elderly couples watching television together. The community that Eleanor and I had spent our lives serving, that Robert Cross had tried to exploit, that Madison now wanted to protect and strengthen. There's one condition, I said finally. Anything. We do this Eleanor's way, slowly, carefully, with respect for the people we're trying to help. No grand gestures, no publicity campaigns, no corporate announcements about our philanthropy. We help people because they need help, not because it makes us look good. Madison extended her hand and I shook it firmly. Partners? She asked. Partners, I agreed. As we prepared to leave the community center that night, I realized that the most unlikely transformation of all had occurred. The woman who'd called me a fossil had become my partner in building a legacy that would outlast both of us. The granddaughter of my greatest enemy had chosen to honor the memory of my greatest love. Eleanor would have said that some stories are too beautiful for coincidence, too meaningful for chance. She would have said that grace sometimes arrives disguised as conflict, and redemption often wears the mask of betrayal. She would have been right, as always. The emergency board meeting that would determine Madison's fate and the future of everything we'd planned was scheduled for 10 o'clock Monday morning. But the real battle began at 7:30 when I received a phone call that chilled me to the bone. Mr. Whitmore, this is Detective Sarah Chen with the County Sheriff's Office. We need you to come to the Cross Development Building immediately. There's been an incident. I drove downtown, with my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles went white. The Cross Development building was surrounded by police cars, their red and blue lights painting the morning sky in ominous colors. Tommy Rivera stood on the sidewalk, looking shell-shocked, still wearing pajamas under his hastily thrown-on jacket. "What happened?" I demanded as I approached him. "Someone broke into the building last night," Tommy said, his voice hollow with disbelief. "They took everything, all the documents we'd gathered about Robert Cross Sr.'s crimes, all the evidence of the property theft, all the financial records proving what he did to you." My blood turned to ice. "What about the transfer deeds, the foundation paperwork?" "Gone, all of it, like it never existed." Detective Chen approached us, a compact woman with intelligent eyes and the bearing of someone who'd seen too much human nature at its worst. "Mr. Whitmore, I understand you had documents stored in this building that related to historical business disputes." "Historical fraud," I corrected. "But yes, we had extensive evidence of criminal activity dating back 40 years. Well, someone was very selective about what they took. They left computers, office equipment, petty cash, even ignored a safe containing $20,000 in emergency funds. But every piece of paper related to Cross and Whitmore construction from the 1970s and 1980s is gone. The implication was clear. This wasn't a random burglary. Someone had targeted the specific evidence that could expose Robert Cross Sr.'s crimes and validate my claims against the company. "Where's Madison?" I asked Tommy. "Inside, in the conference room. She's been here since 6 a.m. trying to piece together what we've lost." I found Madison sitting at the polished conference table where she'd first learned the truth about her grandfather's betrayal. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed from crying, and scattered before her were the few documents that had survived the theft, mostly photocopies and notes that had been in her personal files. "They took everything, Harold," she said without looking up. "Every piece of evidence that proved what my grandfather did to you. Every document that supported our plan to make amends." I sat down across from her, studying the remaining papers. Who else knew about these documents? The board members, obviously, my father, a few senior executives who've been with the company for decades. She paused, then added quietly, "And my grandmother." "Your grandmother?" Madison nodded miserably. "Catherine Cross, my grandfather's widow. She's 92 years old but sharp as a tack. She's been the real power behind Cross Development since my grandfather died, even though she's never held an official position." I remembered Catherine Cross vaguely, a steel magnolia who'd stood beside Robert at company functions, beautiful and charming and absolutely ruthless when protecting her family's interests. "She called me yesterday after hearing about the foundation plans," Madison continued. "She said I was being manipulated by a bitter old man, seeking revenge, that I was throwing away everything my grandfather built based on forged documents and false accusations." "What did you tell her?" "I told her the truth, about you saving my life, about the evidence we'd found, about my decision to use the stolen money to fund community development projects." Madison finally looked up at me, her eyes filled with pain. I thought she deserved to know why I was dismantling grandfather's legacy. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Catherine Cross had spent 70 years protecting her husband's reputation and her family's fortune. She wasn't about to let her granddaughter destroy both, based on what she probably saw as ancient history and misguided guilt. "She hired professionals," I said quietly. "This wasn't a crime of opportunity. Someone with sophisticated knowledge of document recovery and evidence destruction did this." Tommy appeared in the doorway, his face grim. "The board meeting has been moved up to 9 o'clock. Word is spreading about the break-in, and several board members are demanding Madison's immediate removal as CEO." "On what grounds?" Madison asked. "Mental incompetence," Tommy replied reluctantly. "They're claiming that your decision to give away the company's assets, combined with your hospitalization for stress, demonstrates that you're unfit to lead the organization." Madison laughed bitterly. "My grandmother's handiwork again. She's probably spent the weekend convincing the board that I've lost my mind, that I'm being manipulated by false evidence and emotional manipulation. I stood up and walked to the windows overlooking downtown, seeing the city I'd helped build with new eyes. Every bridge, every building, every street represented a choice between serving the community or exploiting it. Robert Cross Sr. had made his choice 45 years ago, and now his widow was making sure that choice would never be challenged. "There's something you need to know," Madison said quietly. "Before the documents were stolen, I made copies of the most important ones. They're in a safety deposit box at First National Bank." "That's good news," Tommy said, visibly relieved. "No," Madison shook her head. "It's not. Because without the originals, without the complete chain of documentation, those copies can be dismissed as forgeries. My grandmother was smart enough to make sure we can't prove anything." I turned back from the window, seeing Madison and Tommy's faces reflecting the despair I felt in my own heart. We'd come so close to justice, so close to redemption, only to have it snatched away by an old woman's determination to protect a legacy built on lies. "There's one thing your grandmother didn't count on," I said slowly. "What's that?" "She assumed that this was about money and revenge. She thought that if she could eliminate the evidence and discredit our claims, I'd slink away defeated and you'd fall in line with family expectations." Madison looked at me with growing hope. "But it's not about money and revenge." "No," I smiled, feeling Eleanor's spirit guiding my thoughts. "It's about choosing what kind of people we want to be going forward. The documents your grandmother stole can't change that choice. The evidence she destroyed can't alter our consciences." I sat back down at the conference table, looking at these two young people who'd become my unlikely allies in a war I'd never chosen to fight. "The board meeting starts in an hour," I said. "They expect to find Madison broken and defeated, ready to abandon her plans and return to business as usual. Instead, they're going to discover that some convictions run deeper than evidence, and some decisions can't be stolen by corporate pirates in the night." "What are you suggesting?" Tommy asked. "I'm suggesting that we walk into that boardroom and announce our plans, regardless of what evidence we can or can't prove. I'm suggesting that we choose to do the right thing because it's right, not because we can force anyone to acknowledge past wrongs." Madison's eyes began to shine with something that looked like courage reborn. "They'll say we're crazy," she said. "Let them," I replied. "Sometimes the craziest thing you can do is choose principles over profit. Sometimes the most radical act is simple decency." As we prepared for the battle that would determine not just Madison's future, but the kind of community we'd leave for the next generation, I realized that Catherine Cross had made a crucial miscalculation. She'd tried to defeat us by stealing evidence of her husband's crimes, but she'd forgotten that the most powerful evidence isn't written on paper, it's written on human hearts. The most important documents are the ones that can never be stolen. At 8:50 that morning, Madison Cross walked into the boardroom of her family's company with the bearing of a woman who'd made peace with losing everything. I followed behind her, my 80-year-old frame steadied by a cane in one hand and 60 years of principles in my heart. Tommy brought up the rear, carrying a single folder that contained our entire defense. The boardroom was packed beyond capacity. 12 official board members sat around the polished table, their faces ranging from concerned to openly hostile. Catherine Cross occupied the chair at the head of the table, a position she'd never officially held but had clearly claimed for this crucial meeting. At 92, she remained formidable, silver hair perfectly styled, sharp blue eyes that missed nothing, and the kind of presence that commanded rooms through sheer force of will. "Madison, dear," Catherine said, with the sweet venom that Southern women had perfected over centuries, "I'm so glad you're feeling well enough to join us. We've all been terribly worried about your episode." The way she said episode made it clear that Madison's hospitalization had been reframed as evidence of mental instability rather than the stress response of learning terrible truths about her family. "I'm fine, grandmother," Madison replied, taking her seat at the opposite end of the table. I'm here to discuss the future of cross-development. Board member Robert Harrison, a man who'd served the company for 30 years, cleared his throat nervously. Madison, we've heard some disturbing reports about your recent decisions, cancelling major contracts, talking about giving away company assets, making wild accusations about your grandfather's business practices. Are you referring to the evidence that was stolen from this building last night? Madison asked pointedly. Catherine's expression didn't change, but I caught the slightest flicker of satisfaction in her eyes. She knew exactly what had happened to those documents. Evidence, Harrison continued. Madison, the police report says there was a break-in, but nothing of real value was taken. Some old paperwork, perhaps, but nothing that would constitute evidence of wrongdoing. Tommy stepped forward and placed our single folder on the table. Actually, we do have some documentation that survived. He opened the folder to reveal not legal documents or financial records, but photographs. Pictures of the community center, the Veterans Housing Complex, the bridge over Miller's Creek. Pictures of families helped, children taught, lives touched by Harold Whitmore's decades of service. What are we supposed to do with these? Demanded board member Patricia Wells, a sharp-eyed woman who joined the company straight from law school 20 years earlier. Look at them, Madison said simply. Really look at them. She stood and began placing the photographs around the table, one in front of each board member. Pictures of Harold teaching children carpentry, pictures of Eleanor organizing community dinners, pictures of veteran families moving into homes that Harold had helped rebuild after the flood. This is Harold Whitmore, Madison said, pointing to me. The man my grandfather systematically destroyed through fraud, forgery, and character assassination. The man who saved my life when I was 5 years old. The man who built half the infrastructure this company has profited from for 40 years. Catherine Cross's voice cut through the room like a blade. Madison, you're embarrassing yourself. This elderly gentleman may have fed you some touching stories about the past, but you're allowing sentiment to cloud your business judgment. No, grandmother, Madison replied firmly. I'm allowing conscience to guide my business decisions. There's a difference. I decided it was time to speak for myself. Ladies and gentlemen, I said, rising slowly to my feet, I'm 80 years old. I've survived war, poverty, betrayal, and loss. I've built bridges that still carry traffic, designed schools that still educate children, and helped create communities that still thrive. The room fell silent, but I could see the skepticism in most faces. To them, I was just another old man with grievances against their successful company. You want to know what Robert Cross Sr. stole from me? It wasn't just money or property. He stole recognition for a lifetime of service. He stole credit for work that helped thousands of people. He stole the satisfaction of knowing that my efforts were valued and remembered. Catherine leaned forward, her voice dripping with false sympathy. Mr. Whitmore, I'm sure you believe these stories, but memory can be unreliable at your age. My husband was a respected businessman who built this company through hard work and legitimate success. Your husband, I said quietly, wrote a letter confessing to everything. A letter he never sent, but one that your granddaughter found among his private papers. I watched Catherine's composure crack slightly. She knew about that letter, had probably been the one to steal it along with all the other evidence. Even if such a letter existed, she said carefully, it would hardly constitute legal proof of anything. You're right, I agreed. Legal proof is gone, stolen by professionals who knew exactly what they were looking for. But some truths don't require documentation. Tommy stepped forward with another photograph, this one showing Madison as a 5-year-old in a hospital bed surrounded by medical equipment. This is your granddaughter on December 15th, 1994, I said to Catherine. The day she nearly died, falling through ice on Miller's Creek. The day I pulled her unconscious body from freezing water and brought her back to life. Catherine's facade finally cracked completely. You can't prove that. I don't have to prove it, I replied. Your granddaughter's alive, that's proof enough. Madison stood up, her voice steady and strong. Every person in this room has benefited from Harold Whitmore's work. The building we're sitting in was constructed using engineering principles he developed. The bridge you all drive over to get here was his design. The community that supports this company exists because Harold Whitmore spent 60 years building it up instead of tearing it down. This is all very touching, Patricia Wells interjected, but we're here to discuss business realities, not sentimental stories about the past. No, Madison said firmly. We're here to decide what kind of company Cross Development will be going forward. We can continue operating the way my grandfather did, maximizing profit by displacing communities and exploiting people's needs. Or we can become the kind of company Harold Whitmore would have built, one that creates value by serving people instead of using them. Catherine stood up, her voice taking on the commanding tone that had intimidated business rivals for 7 decades. Madison, you're 28 years old. You've been CEO for less than 2 years. You think you can waltz in here and dismantle everything your grandfather spent his life building based on the fantasies of a bitter old man? The insult hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. But instead of anger, I felt something unexpected. Pity for a woman who'd spent 92 years defending lies, who'd chosen family loyalty over truth so consistently that she could no longer tell the difference. Mrs. Cross, I said gently, I'm not bitter. I'm grateful. Grateful that I got to spend 55 years married to Eleanor Whitmore, the kindest woman who ever lived. Grateful that I got to save your granddaughter's life and watch her grow into someone with the courage to choose conscience over comfort. I looked around the room at faces that reflected confusion, skepticism, and the first stirrings of understanding. Your husband's crimes didn't destroy me. They freed me to discover that some things matter more than money. Your granddaughter's insults didn't break me. They reminded me that my story isn't over yet. Madison walked over to stand beside me, her choice clear to everyone in the room. The vote is simple, she announced. Support the transformation of Cross Development into a community-focused organization, or remove me as CEO and continue business as usual. But understand this, if you choose the latter, you're not just firing me. You're choosing to side with theft over justice, profit over principle, lies over truth. As the board members began to murmur among themselves, I realized that the most important moment of my 80 years was about to unfold, not because of what I might gain or lose, but because the choice these people made would determine what kind of world we'd leave for the next generation. Eleanor always said that character is revealed not in moments of comfort, but in moments of choice. This was Cross Development's moment of choice, and mine. The vote wasn't even close. 9 board members voted to remove Madison as CEO. Only 3, Tommy Rivera, Madison herself, and surprisingly board member Patricia Wells, voted to support the transformation plan. Catherine Cross didn't vote at all. She simply smiled with the satisfaction of a woman who'd protected her family's empire one final time. Madison, Catherine said as the meeting concluded, her voice carrying the false warmth of a victor trying to appear gracious. You can remain with the company in a reduced capacity, perhaps heading up our community relations department. You've clearly developed a passion for charity work. The dismissal was complete and devastating. Madison Cross, the woman who'd tried to transform a legacy built on lies into something honest and good, had been stripped of power and reduced to a token position managing the company's public image. But as we walked out of that boardroom together, Madison, Tommy, and myself, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades, the fierce joy of absolute freedom. I'm sorry, Harold, Madison said as we stood in the parking lot, her voice thick with tears of defeat and rage. I thought we could change things. I thought conscience would matter more than profit. Oh, but it did, I replied, surprising her with my calm tone. Conscience mattered enough for you to risk everything. That's not defeat, Madison. That's victory of the most important kind. Tommy looked between us, confused by my apparent serenity in the face of our crushing loss. But they won, Mr. Whitmore. They stole the evidence, removed Madison from power, and preserved the status quo. Nothing's changed. Everything's changed, I corrected gently, because this morning 3 people chose to do the right thing regardless of consequences. 3 people decided that principle matters more than profit. That's not nothing, Tommy. That's everything. Over the next 2 weeks, the true extent of our defeat became clear. Cross Development announced that Madison had stepped down as CEO due to health concerns and philosophical differences with the board. Robert Harrison was named as her replacement, with a mandate to return the company to its core mission of profitable development. The community center demolition was rescheduled for the following month. The veteran housing complex was sold to a developer who planned to replace it with luxury condos. The bridge over Miller's Creek was slated for replacement with a wider, more efficient design that would eliminate the walking paths Eleanor and I had insisted on including. Everything Harold Whitmore had built was being systematically erased, just as Robert Cross Sr. had always intended. But something unexpected was happening in response. It started with Colonel Patricia Hayes and the VFW Post. When news of the boardroom confrontation spread through the veteran community, they organized a protest outside Cross Development headquarters. 47 families, the same families whose homes I'd helped rebuild after the flood, showed up with signs reading, "Honor Harold Whitmore" and "Community over Profit." Tommy, now unemployed but somehow more energetic than I'd ever seen him, coordinated a social media campaign that shared the story of my partnership with Robert Cross Sr. and Madison's attempt at redemption. The hashtag #BuildBridgesNotWalls began trending locally, then regionally, then nationally, as people shared their own stories about choosing service over success. Madison used her severance package to rent a small office downtown, establishing the Eleanor Whitmore Foundation exactly as we'd planned. Without access to the cross-development fortune, the foundation's budget was modest, but its mission remained transformational. "We may not be able to save the community center," Madison told me during our first official foundation meeting, "but we can build something better, something that honors your wife's memory and your shared values." The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. My granddaughter Sarah. She called me 3 weeks after the board meeting, her voice carrying an emotion I'd never heard from her before, genuine respect. "Grandpa," she said, "I saw the news coverage about what happened with Cross Development. I watched the video of your speech to the board members. Someone had recorded the meeting on their phone and shared it online, where it had been viewed nearly 1 million times. Comments poured in from people who'd been inspired by an 80-year-old man's refusal to accept injustice, by a young woman's willingness to sacrifice personal wealth for community good. "I need to apologize," Sarah continued. "I spent so many years being embarrassed by your choices, thinking you were naive for choosing principle over profit. But watching you in that boardroom, seeing the respect in people's faces when you spoke about service and sacrifice, I finally understood what Aunt Eleanor saw in you." "What's that, sweetheart?" "Greatness, not the kind that gets measured in bank statements, but the kind that gets measured in lives touched and communities built. The kind that lasts long after the money is spent and the buildings crumble." Sarah had done more than just call to apologize. She'd convinced her law firm to take on the Eleanor Whitmore Foundation as a pro bono client, providing legal services for community development projects. She'd liquidated her own investment portfolio to provide seed funding for the foundation's first initiatives. And most importantly, she'd moved back home to help us build the kind of legacy that her grandfather Harold and step-grandmother Eleanor had always envisioned. The real vindication came 6 months later, when Cross Development faced a federal investigation for financial irregularities spanning 4 decades. It turned out that Catherine Cross's decision to steal evidence had only delayed the inevitable. Other victims of Robert Cross Sr. schemes had come forward with their own documentation, and a pattern of fraud stretching back to the 1970s had finally come to light. But by then, I was too busy building the future to spend much time thinking about the past. The Eleanor Whitmore Foundation had purchased a defunct shopping center and transformed it into a community hub that included affordable housing, local businesses, educational programs, and healthcare services. The project employed local contractors, supported local families, and created the kind of sustainable development that served people instead of exploiting them. Madison threw herself into the work with the passion of someone who'd found her true calling. Tommy became the foundation's project manager, coordinating between architects, contractors, and community members with the energy of a young man who discovered that work could be about more than paychecks. And me? I spent my days doing what I'd always done, building bridges, not the kind made of steel and concrete, though we built those too, the kind made of trust and respect and shared commitment to something larger than ourselves. On a warm evening in May, nearly a year after Madison Cross had first called me a fossil, I stood in the garden Eleanor had planted, watching the sun set over the community we'd helped nurture. Madison and Tommy were with me, along with Sarah and dozens of families whose lives had been touched by the foundation's work. We were celebrating the completion of our first major project, a mixed-use development that had transformed a blighted neighborhood into a thriving community while preserving the history and character that made it special. "Harold," Madison said, approaching me with a framed photograph, "we wanted to give you something." The picture showed the dedication ceremony for the Eleanor Whitmore Community Center, the cornerstone project of our foundation's work. In the center of the photo stood a bronze plaque with words that took my breath away. "In memory of Eleanor Martinez Whitmore, and in honor of Harold Whitmore, who taught us that the greatest buildings are the communities we create together, and the strongest bridges are the ones that connect human hearts." "This is what legacy looks like," Madison said softly. "Not money or property or corporate empires, but lives touched and communities strengthened and principles lived out through daily choices." As the sun disappeared behind the horizon and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, I thought about the journey that had brought us all together, a young woman's cruel words that had awakened something sleeping in an old man's heart, a family's crimes that had ultimately led to redemption, a partnership built on shared values that had created something beautiful from the wreckage of betrayal. Eleanor had been right, as always. Some stories are too beautiful for coincidence, too meaningful for chance. Sometimes the greatest victories come disguised as defeats, and sometimes the most important bridges are built from the rubble of what seemed like failure. I was 81 years old, and my story was far from over. In fact, as I stood there surrounded by people who'd chosen to build bridges instead of walls, I realized that the best chapters were still being written. The fossil had become a foundation. The ending had become a beginning. And Harold Whitmore's legacy would live on in every life touched, every community strengthened, every bridge built between what was and what could be. Eleanor would have been proud.